Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to what is going to be a great panel about a small, obscure, faraway country you probably never heard of, China. And we are going to tackle the question today, which in fact is probably the most important question for the future of the global economy right now, which is the future of China's economy. And to discuss it today, a really wonderful panel joins us. On my left is Henry Paulson, the former US Treasury Secretary, former chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs, who's now chairman of the Paulson Institute, which is promoting environmentally sustainable growth in China. To my right, Sheryl WuDunn, a former Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Congratulations, I'm jealous. And now author and business executive and co-founder of FullSky Capital. And also joining us, Bob Iger, of course, CEO of the Walt Disney Company since 2005. Hank, I'd like to start with you. You've been going to China for 20 years, I believe. You visited 100 times. And you told an interviewer in April of last year that you felt that the Chinese economic reform agenda had stalled. Since then, we had the November Party Congress, which unveiled a new reform agenda, which state media billed as a, quote, new historical starting point. But some observers remain unimpressed, including your eventual successor as Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, who said in February that he had yet to see signs of reform at, quote, the speed we want. Chinese state media did not take kindly to that statement. One editorial actually referred to Mr. Lew as a former housekeeper of the White House, which I think must have been a misunderstanding of what the title Chief of Staff describes. But the Chinese didn't appreciate that response. I wonder where you come down on this question of how real the reforms were, how they're working out, and what's encouraging you and discouraging you.
Okay, well, Mike, thank you. And first of all, I'm really honored to be on this panel with people who really understand China. I don't think anybody knows more about getting things done in China than Bob. And I've read a lot of good books on China, and none better than China Wakes with Sheryl. So a terrific panel. I want to just step back a minute and say, as you said, I've been going to China for a long time, and what's going on now is as consequential as any time I can remember. And it's of a huge magnitude. I happen to believe that it's going to make a big difference to the U.S. and to people all over the world. The next 300 million people going to the cities are going to drive economic and environmental outcomes globally. So it's huge. That you have to start by saying that, that the reforms which have driven double-digit growth for decades have run out of gas. So this is a country that needs a new economic model of growth, very much. They need one that's much more dependent on markets and domestic-led growth, much less dependent on government investment and exports. They've got a financial system, and the big part of the reason for this is it stalled. For the last 10 years, we didn't see much reform. The financial market reform stalled. So we have, just to give you a couple of examples, we have a municipal finance system that is not sustainable, largely reliant on mayors taking land from the farmers, selling it to developers. You've got a banking system which caps the interest on deposits, takes unfair advantage of Chinese savers, channels the money at favorable rates to state-owned enterprises. So you've got, and all of this has led to a massive buildup of bad debts at the municipal level, state-owned enterprises, shadow banking issues. You have social stresses because anyone, I'm looking at Antonio Villaraigosa, when he went to China with me in 2011, we thought the air was as dirty as we'd ever seen. Driving a car in the day, it almost looked like night. Well, I got to tell you, it's only gotten worse. And so you've got stresses from the air, the water, corruption, farmers' land transfer rights. So against this, reform needs to proceed. And So you've got now, to your question, so Xi Jinping lays out, the new General Party Secretary, lays out just a massively ambitious reform program. Economic, social reforms, very, very broad. No one could find fault with the economic reform program he laid out. That's the good news. The bad news is it is really difficult to transform and change the growth model for a $9 trillion economy. How the scope, the scale, how you sequence these reforms. You can't fix a municipal finance system unless you have a new fiscal system for the whole country, unless you have nationwide tax reform, unless mayors have got their budget authority, which they don't have now. When you've got 200 to 300 million of workers living in the cities without legal status, how you free up and normalize the labor market is not an easy thing, and there are huge vested interests and ideological interests that are going to resist this. That's the bad news. The other good news is you've got with Xi Jinping, he's got the most difficult job in the world. He's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. He seems very comfortable in this position. He's a natural politician. He's done a lot to shore up his personal popularity. He's not scripted. He's very spontaneous. And the first thing he's done, which is he's consolidated power and authority. He's looked, and in his view, there's no strong institution to drive reforms other than the party. So I've never heard more ever about the party in driving this reforms. He's taken on a very aggressive anti-corruption campaign, which again builds popular support and goes against the vested interest in the state-owned enterprises. Now, to give you a quick response to Jack Liu's question, I think what I'm going to look at, it's too early to tell. I think he's done the right things in terms of reform. So the thing I'm looking at is competition. How quickly they open up the competition. Because the economic reforms they've said all the right things. The markets are going to be decisive. They are going to play a bigger role. The government's going to play a lesser role. And so the things I'm looking at are to what extent are they going to let the private sector, which is the future of that country, compete with state-owned enterprises on a level playing field in important industries like finance and engineering and energy and so on. To what extent are they going to really take away the special subsidies of the state-owned enterprises? And then thirdly, to what extent are they going to let global companies, international companies come in and compete? There are some reformers that just want to open up to the private sector in China. And I'm going to look at first at what they're doing in the financial markets because they've studied that the longest, and I see some very positive signs. So I am encouraged to date, but I think it's a massively difficult proposition, and Xi has given himself, let me tell you the other thing that I'm most encouraged by. He's given himself 7 years, and he says, I want the ball. I'm putting my credibility on the line. Presidents and general party secretaries don't normally drive economic reform. He's himself heading up this central reform leading group, which is going to spearhead the reform at the national level.
Well, you mentioned international investment, foreign companies, and Bob, Disney is one of the quintessential all-American brands, but you've had to learn a tremendous amount about China. Why don't you tell us about the really big, important project? Well, they're all important to you, I'm sure, but this huge new project that you're building, and what is it, Shanghai Disney? Let people here know what the project is, and then we'll talk a little more about the business climate for you.
Sure, because it's probable that project represents the largest foreign investment in China today. We are in the middle of building a Disney resort, or Disneyland resort, in Pudong, just outside central Shanghai. We call it a resort because not only will it have the typical attractions and a castle that a Disneyland park would have, but we're also building hotels and significant retail, dining, and entertainment area as well. So as we speak, there are roughly 8,000 construction workers not only working on the property, but living on the property to build a quintessential Disney experience in the largest city in the largest country from a population perspective in the world, which I think is a huge statement, not just in terms of our confidence in the market, but a huge statement by the government of Shanghai and the government of China in terms of allowing competition into the region. Now, I realize that Disney, in a way, stands alone in many respects. I don't mean to sound like I'm bragging, but in terms of that, creating that kind of experience, so it may be special. But it's clear that we are serving a number of interests in China with this project, namely helping them migrate to a more service-oriented economy, creating jobs, bringing a quality experience, entertainment experience, recreation experience to the people of China, essentially showing an openness to some level of Western culture and Western media. So I think that this is definitely a very, very mutually beneficial project for China and for Disney.
And I gather you come bearing some news today that might give us a sense of your view of your bullishness about China's economy. Why don't you tell us what that is?
Well, since we reached an agreement to build this park and since we put a shovel in the ground just a few years ago, we've seen dramatic changes in terms of the development of China. Some were mentioned earlier, urbanization being one, growth of the middle class, growth of media in general, whether it's digital media, ownership of smartphones. The movie business has grown dramatically, 3 times the size that it was 4 years ago. It's the second largest movie market in the world today, and it will be the largest by 2020. Just to give you some perspective, there are 18 movie screens opened per day in the first quarter of this year in China. It's growing that rapidly. There's also huge growth in e-commerce, and most importantly, we've seen dramatic growth in tourism. It was estimated that Chinese took 3.2 billion visits within China, traveling from one place to another as tourists in 2013, which generated about $480 billion in spending. So with all of the development that we've seen, as well as more appreciation for and more interest in the Disney brand in China, which has also been helped by some of the developments I just talked about, notably movies, for instance, we've decided that we would accelerate the expansion of the park while we're building it. We always expected that this park would expand and that it had huge potential, but we've been so impressed with what we've seen that with our partners, the Shanghai government, we're announcing today that we're putting an additional $800 million into the project. So we'll make it a $5.5 billion project, the onset. And with that will come more attractions, basically more entertainment, and some other services as well, food and dining being another aspect of it, other forms of entertainment.
Well, congratulations.
So it's a big step, a huge vote of confidence, not just in the market, but obviously in this project.
I think, Sheryl, this is a good opportunity to bring you in and to talk about this story, this transition that's happening in China, that has to happen in China by all accounts, transition to a consumption economy where you have this huge middle class that will have more disposable income and will be doing things like going to Shanghai Disney. Remind us, why is that so important, and what does this emerging middle class look like? Are we seeing this consumer emerge fast enough? I noticed that Apple's last quarterly report showed a really dramatic rise in iPhone sales in China. It was really good news for the company. Is that the kind of thing that needs to happen? Is it happening fast enough?
Well, thank you very much for having me on this panel. I actually think that if you look at what Hank said and then what Bob said, you have a tale of two countries. You basically have a China that, on one hand, is highly regulated state sector, controlling the banks, the utilities, the telecoms, and then you have the Wild West that does, of course, you had a lot of government help with your project. But the Wild West has allowed China to have a lot of these great brands. We've heard of Alibaba, we know Baidu, a lot of these companies that have actually merged in the private sector, Foxconn. But it also has allowed the mom and pops to bubble up. So I have a friend who last year started a tutoring center, and now she's on site 2 and 3. I have another friend who started an auto repair shop 3 years ago, and he's on site 5 and 6. So it's not just the big guys, but also the little guys too. But the downside of that is that you've got very little regulation in this very Wild West. So for instance, A couple of years ago, melamine found its way into the milk supply, and so we had a lot of Chinese kids drinking melamine-laced milk. That's how you can get a hypodermic company, a supplier who got a contract with a hospital, who invested, basically they take the hypodermic needles from the hospital and they recycle them. But the investment that they made was actually in the repackaging of the hypodermic needles. The recycling part was just a hose and spray wash. And then you get the village in Gansu that basically says, okay, well, they live downstream from a factory that's pouring effluent into the river, and they were drinking the river water. That's the only source of water they have. And it was causing birth defects in the children. They were going crazy. A few years later, they got clean water piped into their homes, but they had started the fish business, growing fish, raising fish in the water that's still in the river that still is getting the effluents from the factory. And so we asked them, well, how could you possibly want to eat fish that's been raised in this water? And they say, oh, we wouldn't dare touch it. We sell it in Lanzhou. So you can see how the Wild West really does make it very fearful for any Chinese consumer to buy certain things. So what does that mean for the Chinese in this transition to consumption? Well, the consumption, it's a growing piece of the pie. It used to be 35% of the economy. Now it's about 45 to 47%. So it's definitely growing. The question is, can it grow faster than the drop in the economic growth rate? And that's a real question. So what's happened to the Chinese consumer? I think a lot of what's happened to the Chinese consumer has been triggered by what's going on in this Wild West. So, Bob, you mentioned e-commerce. That's probably been one of the single most important changes that has changed the landscape of consumption in China in a big way. So e-commerce, we have e-commerce here, and we usually use it mainly out of convenience. It's faster, maybe a little bit cheaper, but in China, it's much more significantly cheaper. So it allows the middle-class consumer to actually buy, to have choices to buy. How many of you have been to a Chinese department store? Okay, so all right, so maybe you have an experience. So I was just in a Chinese department store in Xi'an, a second-tier city, trying to find some winter boots. I scoured the entire floor of shoes. There wasn't a single pair of boots that was cheaper than $200. Now, it's not like it was a $1,000 boot selling for $200. It was probably a $150 boot selling for $200. It's very expensive. But now what e-commerce has done is allowed the Chinese consumer the middle-class consumer to afford a lot of the things that they couldn't buy in the department store. And these department stores are not just state-run, they're also private-run. There's just a high bar. It's very expensive.
What do you think about this transition to a consumer economy? Is it happening fast enough? And in particular, Sheryl raised some worrisome issues about quality of life, defective products, and the environment, which is a particular interest of yours. The Economist this week described an ongoing middle-class emigration from the country, which it describes as the greatest and most consequential emigration wave in modern Chinese history, which it attributes to these quality of life issues, primarily the environment, but also some of the kind of safety issues. How do you size up the progress of this consumer evolution?
Well, I have two sets of comments. First, look at the economic numbers. Consumption is growing in China faster than virtually any large economy, and maybe faster than any economy. So consumption is growing very quickly. Now, as a percentage of the total growth, it's not growing as quickly as it needs to be. I talk about consumption and also domestic-led growth. I mean, they need a service industry. But to get to Sheryl's point, which I think is really, really important, here's the way I talk about it and think about it. China does not have the institutions it needs to manage an economy the size as it is and the country as big as it is. So on the one hand, Xi's program of government modernization, institution building, is every bit as important and massive and difficult as the overall economic reforms. And this has to do with everything from the court systems and to just and they need a lot more centralization, which when you talk to China people that know just a bit about China, they sort of say more centralization. They think, well, guess what? The Communist Party is too centralized. But take your example of the environment, okay? The environment, you need more centralization if you want to enforce consistently clean air and water standards. But they don't have the institution to do it. The Ministry of Environmental Protection has got somewhere around 3,000 people at corporate headquarters. They've got literally thousands of people in the different bureaus at the county level, the provincial level, the city level, but they don't work for the headquarters, and they're not properly trained. So the government needs to improvise. And so what you're seeing now is Xi Jinping again has turned to the party and has said, performance, when I'm looking at the performance of mayors, it used to be if you were a mayor, you know, Bob knows this, Sheryl knows this, when you sit down with a mayor, the first thing they do is just recite all their GDP stats, you know, and it's just a litany, the jobs creation, GDP, because if they could increase GDP and jobs, minimize social unrest, avoid a big scandal, they're a safe home. And then they went on. But now they're going to be held accountable for the environmental record. But I think there's an interesting paradox. When you say, why don't they have the institutions they need? Maybe because their party's so strong. And because they don't have the institutions, they have to come back and rely on the party. So how they're going to put in the institutions they need, but because right now it's a political imperative, because there's a rising middle class, and what's implicit in Sheryl's comments is people aren't going to tolerate. They're not going to live in Beijing. They want safe food. They don't want to die from the air they're breathing.
And well, that gives me an opportunity to ask Bob a question that I think is really interesting. To what degree, when you're planning a park like the one in Shanghai, are you thinking about pollution? People don't want to go outside and go on rides that are exposed to the air when the air is gray, and maybe particularly when they have children, maybe making them sick. So how much is that a factor in your planning, and what is your, do you feel like that the government is taking this problem seriously enough in a way that makes you comfortable?
Well, first of all, it led to a decision to put the park in Shanghai, certainly rather than Beijing. Mm-hmm. There were weather issues as well, but clearly the air quality in Beijing was worse at the time that we decided this. I think it's worsened since. It's definitely an issue, though. It's something that we are somewhat aware of and concerned about. Interestingly enough, our partner is primarily the government of Shanghai, even though the government of China has been certainly involved to some extent. The government of Shanghai has been very interested in environmental issues. That's not just the quality of the construction and the working conditions that have been created for these thousands of workers, but also for how the park is operated. For instance, we created a combined heating and cooling plant that is going to be 3 times as efficient as a typical plant would be and give off 60% less emissions. That's not only going to serve the park and the facility itself, but an area that is 25 square miles around it, for instance. The government was a very willing partner there, in part because they wanted to hold that up as a model. Now, it might not be as scalable as one might need, but there was clear interest in the government of Shanghai's part in us doing that. The same is true for how we're going to deal with waste, how we deal with runoff water, et cetera, and so on. It's been very much a part not just of Disney's values and standards, but of the partnership's values and standards.
By the way, this is Disney's second park, if I'm not mistaken. There's one in Hong Kong that opened 10 years ago. I wondered if you wanted to reflect briefly on how dealing with the government, the regulatory, cultural, political environment, the reception that large American company gets has changed over that time. Has it become easier? Have you seen a real change in attitudes there?
I think it's no secret to this group that there are numerous challenges in China in terms of doing business. It is a land, I believe, of great opportunity, but it's a land of great challenge. And in order to succeed in China, you have to have a lot of knowledge, culture, people, political practices. You have to be incredibly flexible. You have to be tremendously patient. It's definitely a marathon, not a sprint. And you also have to be tenacious. You've got to determine what it is you want to accomplish, be somewhat flexible, but you got to keep pushing forward. Our negotiation to build this park was a decade long, as a for instance. That is patience. There were times I wasn't quite sure I had enough, but we did. I would say over the period of time that we've been involved, the government has become more of a willing partner. I think some of it has to do with seeing more tangible evidence sort of what this is going to be and getting more excited about it. Some of it has to do with some of the changes that we talked about. As a for instance, they put in a lot more high-speed rail so that by the time we open in 2015, 330 million income-qualified people will live within a 3-hour trip to this park. 330 million people that we would consider capable of affording a visit to Shanghai Disneyland.
Well,
so that obviously is valuable to us, which is one of the reasons why we're accelerating expansion, but that's of great interest to the government. So I'm not suggesting that they've gotten necessarily easier, but they've been good partners all along, and I'd say their excitement for this project, their enthusiasm about it has made them better partners along the way.
And before I go back to you, Sheryl, I just wanted to cue you on a point you raised in our first conversation, which is that you got some good news recently in the relaxation of the one-child policy, which is great news for someone in your business. I wonder if you could talk about projections as a result of that.
When people I know have babies and I send them a nice Disney package of clothes or whatever, or toys or books or whatever, I always write a note saying thank you for helping to support one of Disney's core strategic priorities, basically having more kids. So I did not send the government of China that present, but the relaxation of the one-child policy will result in, I've seen estimates as low as 2 and as high as 4 million extra childbirths a year over the next 20 years. I thumbs up to that.
Right, yeah.
From Disney.
Sheryl, I want to go to you. It's an opportune moment to have you here because we're in the middle of the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square protests. Yesterday, April 27th, was a particularly important anniversary. The demonstrations really took off in size. So we're right in the midst of that historical period in the country. You were there. I just wondered if you wanted to give us your perspective, having lived through that, seen that firsthand, and tell us what your sense is of the political climate in the country now, freedom of communication. We don't see protests like that anymore, certainly. But in some ways, there is more dialogue and discourse. There is social media. People are online, and the government can't control all of that. So how would you sort of compare the political and expression climate there now with what you saw 25 years ago?
Well, 25 years ago was pretty amazing to see on actually April 27th when there were just floods of people, just millions of people walking around in the streets of Beijing in protest. And I remember a friend of mine, a Chinese friend of mine, saying, we've got to get out there, because here I was, writing up something else. We've got to get out there. And I said, why? Because this is history in the making. And none of us really understood what that really could mean. We got out there, and it really was just, it was a free-for-all. People were walking down. They were happy. They thought that this was going to be help bring change to China. Well, of course, it ended up in Tiananmen Square crackdown. I remember the day of the crackdown, I was talking to a Chinese soldier who was carrying an AK-47, and he basically said, "I'm not going to shoot on these people. I like the people here in Beijing." Well, of course, a few hours later, he was asked to shoot on the people. And I remember the saddest thing was that, of course, there were a lot of bodies brought to the hospitals, and there were a lot of wounded students. But the rickshaw drivers were the most amazing. They had rickshaws in those days. They actually would go towards the shooting to carry back the wounded to the hospitals. And it just was a show of solidarity that we care about these students who actually are trying to protest on behalf. So what's amazing now is that there hasn't been any kind of protest, and the Chinese have done a remarkable job of erasing Tiananmen Square from the history books. So talk to any college student in China right now. They have no clue. If you say Tiananmen Square or June 4th, they have no clue what that is. You have to explain it to them. And online, you can't go to June 4th because that's all been sort of censored. It used to be that people would find ways. Okay, instead of June 4th, we'll do May 35th, right? They've also obliterated that. So there's just been amnesia. And I also think that right now, people have too much to lose. Back then, people were much poorer, and they thought if they could get some say over their lives, that their lives would improve. But now their lives have improved dramatically. So there really isn't that much sense of people taking to the streets. Yes, there have been worker protests, partly because of jobs and corruption. So the two things that really, I think, are going to flare up, as Hank mentioned, pollution. I mean, right now, so in the Northeast, in the Midwest, we have snow days when it snows and the schools close. In Shanghai, in fact, they have pollution days when the pollution is so bad that schools close down. So they need to really improve this and not use the fix-it methods where, okay, just shut down the factories for 10 days and then we'll meet our annual goals for the pollution particles per million. So they do need to come up with a much more consistent, because people are going to start caring about their pollution and the corruption, and that is something that they might not necessarily take to the streets, but they might really want to fight for.
Bob, I want to go back to you on this general theme, and Hank, I'll come back to you. Over the weekend, the Chinese government, I guess you would say, canceled the streaming of several popular American television programs on what I think is Hulu, or the Hulu equivalents over there. So if you're in China, you can no longer see The Good Wife, NCIS, The Practice. So this makes vivid the challenges that a content creator like Disney has in trying to get your content over there. This is a country that approves 34 foreign movies to be screened a year. And increasingly, Disney Studios is partnering with domestic Chinese, well, in particular, I know that there's one Shanghai company that you're partnering with to create movies for Chinese consumption. So how much of a problem is that? And is this partnering, this domestic partnering model, the model going forward for content providers that want deeper access to the Chinese market?
We face a lot of restriction as a company, but perhaps a little less so because of the nature of the product that we create. So the shows that you cited were not Disney shows.
Right.
We still would like more access to media, by the way, because we think it would be good for the brand, good for business. But we have gotten some, and some of our movies, in fact, have done extremely well. The most recent one was Captain America, by the way, which was called The Winter Soldier there, instead of Captain America, but it did over $100 million in that market. And partnering is important. I'll come to that. I don't consider myself a China expert, although I think I'm an expert in Disney in China. And I've observed a number of interesting dynamics as it relates to change. It seems pretty clear to me in the conversations I've had with pretty senior government officials that they know that there's an inevitability of change, and that digital technology, particularly as it affects media and communication, is inevitably going to bring vast change. My sense is they're trying to control that change. They're trying to create some order. Now, I do not mean to sound like an apologist, but one must ask, are we better off in the world with a more stable China and a change that comes under more orderly circumstances than one that comes under much more quickly and perhaps much more violently? Again, I'm not in any way being an apologist, and I believe generally in free access and free speech, et cetera, and I certainly would like more access for Disney. But it's very, very interesting to observe, even thinking about urbanization and all the effects of that. We forget the impact that urbanization had on Western Europe and on the United States, for instance, and back in the 1800s and what it did to cities. It's now going on in China under much more watchful global eye, thanks to media and technology today. And that creates just huge pressure. And I think that digital media also is an unbelievable partner of revolutionaries, for instance, and of change. And it's a very, very difficult and very, very delicate balance. What we've just decided to do is to continue to push for market access hard, and we see some change coming. There was a relaxation of sorts in terms of the number of movies that were let in. I believe that will continue. But we also have agreed that we're better off partnering with local companies and creating content that is more local in feel. There isn't a place in the world we go, by the way, where there isn't a desire to own, control, and in some form or another mold local culture. China's not that unique in that regard. There is, though, this other dynamic, which is how do you control change in an orderly fashion?
What do you think of that, Hank? I mean, is the government's approach tenable? Does it are they making too many sacrifices in the name of stability, and are they potentially stunting innovation? And you look at social media and the internet as such a growth driver here.
So let me, I'm going to comment on that. I want to make one point I should have made when I talked about the environment first. And that is, if you had asked me 10 years ago, you'd listed all the things that China was going to do in terms of the investments in clean energy and all of the shutting down dirty plants and all the steps, and then asked me, would they still have, would the pollution problems have gotten so much worse? I wouldn't have guessed it. But it's all been blown away by this breakneck growth. And so one of the big decisions they're going to need to make is, are they going to be willing to accept changing the growth model and slowing down the growth a bit? I'm looking at, to me, I would rather see growth 7% or a little bit less if it was done in a sustainable way. Okay, now let me get to your question. I think that a number of Americans in particular get somewhat confused when we talk about reform, okay? Because the Chinese idea of reform is not similar, it's similar but very different from ours, okay? When they look at their state-owned enterprises, they're not talking about reform where the government doesn't continue to own the central, the party doesn't continue to own those. That Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he is for strengthening the party. They don't want to go the way of Russia with the Communist Party disintegrating. Matter of fact, one of the first things he said after he was elected was when he went after corruption. He said, if we don't deal with this corruption problem, it will essentially kill off the party. So what he's done is, the other thing you need to recognize is, and Sheryl got to this, they are very attentive to the moods of the people. American politicians with all their polling are not closer. And so what they've done is they've said, what are the biggest issues of social concern right now? And corruption, land transfer rights for farmers, right? Dirty air, dirty water, food security, the one-child policy, re-education labor camps. So what they've done is he's going after all of those. At the same time, they've clamped down on the press and on Weibo and said we need consistent messaging. Now, my view has always been, I'm an American. I really believe that first of all, I have a belief that over time, it's impossible to keep being integrated into the global economy and drive the reforms they're going to drive, and with all the technologies there are, without having the country need to move more toward greater inclusiveness, a continued expansion of liberties. And I think that, Bob made the point about stability. And I think that's a lens that the Chinese look through. If you want to understand why they do a lot of what they do internationally and domestically, it has to do with stability. And my own belief is that in addition to continuing to create the jobs, they are going to have to, part and parcel of stability is going to be the political system is going to continue to evolve. I've watched it evolve. It's going to need to evolve to become more inclusive. I think so. When people ask me about the political side, to me, I think actually that continued reform there will add to stability and lasting prosperity. But I would say right now, the Chinese friends I have realize that the job is so big to get done, and the pressing issues that this government has taken on, that this is a leadership that's very popular, and the pressure is going to be to reform drive the economic reforms and deal with the issues that people care most about. I mean, what's another percentage point or two of GDP growth if it's killing people. So what people care about, clean air, clean water, safe food, go after the corruption. And so Xi Jinping is doing what, at least to my eye, that a lot of the people want him to be doing.
Yeah, if I could just
Yeah,
add
please.
something here, because in some ways, if we look at what happened when you look at what happened with Tiananmen Square, it wasn't when they were repressing the press that this happened. It was actually when they were liberalizing the press. And so it's almost as though as soon as they loosen up, the populace goes into all the holes and then tries to push and push and push. And so I think that's what they're absolutely petrified with. And I totally agree that stability is the most important thing. I mean, there's this saying that, China's like grains, holding grains of sand. I mean, if you don't keep your hands controlled, the grains will fall through. So it's really important for them to maintain control. So Xi Jinping has actually consolidated enormous amount of control and authority, as Hank said, absolutely correct. Now he needs to get legitimacy among the masses. And he's trying to do that through nationalism. He is trying to build much more of a national spirit. I mean, he has this thing called the Chinese dream, the 中国梦. So it's not like the American dream in that we individuals have the dream of building a house and a family and a picket fence. It's more that the Chinese dream is the dream of China being prosperous and strong. And so when you say the Chinese dream, the people think, oh, this is a nationalist thing that we're supposed to believe in the big China. But nationalism also is a double-edged sword. As we've seen with the anti-Japanese protests in China, it's hard to control. The Chinese have the saying, 骑虎难下. It's very easy to get on the tiger and ride it, but it's very hard to get off. And so he's got to play this very delicate balance of trying to maintain sort of popularity and legitimacy, but at the time moving the country forward in the way that it has to be moved. And it isn't going to be easy. So for instance, the media. So in some ways, his anti-corruption campaign could be aided by letting the media in certain areas, in certain categories of corruption, go after. There's no way that they can do it by themselves. But if they have the media to help them ferret out all the corruption, that could be a way that they could slightly loosen it up. But they're never going to open the gates. But they can do it in a strategic way. And so far, we don't see signs of that. But
not only the media, but social media and ordinary citizens complaining that they know that
right.
someone has a house that they didn't get from their government salary. And when I was there in the fall, it was suggested to me that social media, while posing a threat, also allows the government to sort of keep an eye on the conversation, hear what people are saying, and respond to it. Bob, I just want to ask you about something. This is sort of related to communication and expression, but mostly just an interesting fact that caught my eye when I was reading about Disney in China, that you've started dozens of English language schools in China. And I wonder if you wanted to talk about why you did that and what they're doing and how it's going and how the Chinese government, how receptive they were to this idea.
We were looking for growth opportunities globally. We had years back an English language learning program in Japan that was mostly book-based, that did very well, high priced, but did very well. And when we looked at the world, we looked at China, and we saw a large population base, growth of the middle class, growth of spendable income, huge desire for children to get a good education. The one-child policy obviously contributed to that, and English as a second language. It looked like it was a market that was ripe for Disney coming in with a similar English language learning program. And our folks on the ground in China pitched to me an idea, which was to build a basically small supplemental learning center, in Shanghai, that I agreed to do after we spent a significant amount of time and money on a curriculum. And we opened it up with the approval of the equivalent of the Board of Education of Shanghai. We opened one school up. The education system in Shanghai endorsed it, so we didn't have to spend any money marketing. They marketed it for us. And the result is that we've opened up, I think it's just about 40 schools in different markets in China, all with the knowledge of and the approval of local governments. I know that Beijing is aware of it because I've discussed it with some Beijing officials, and everybody seems to be fine with it. It's a high-quality learning environment. It's working for parents and kids because we've seen multiple renewals. There hasn't been as much churn. But what we've discovered over time, it's a very people-intensive business. There's a significant amount of not only training, but management of the people associated with teaching. So I don't know how far ultimately we go with this, except that the product that we created we're very proud of, and it seems to be doing extremely well with the people that spend money on it. So we feel good about it, but I don't know that it necessarily becomes from a scale perspective, the business that we initially thought it would be. However, it is giving birth to digital products, English language learning, that we're just starting to roll out, and we think that there's real potential.
Cheryl, I know you found that really interesting when we were talking about it before. You wanted to elaborate on that a little bit?
Right. No, well, the online world, I think, is actually one of the most vibrant parts of China. And so I think that it's also one of the most innovative parts. So if we actually do see brands and companies coming to the U.S. In larger ways than just buying up, a pork company, but I think that they will be some of the online companies. They're very creative, and they work around the clock. I mean, it is unbelievable how hard these people can work.
Let's zoom back out for a minute. And Hank, let me ask you about the implications of the relationship between China's growth and the global economy and the United States economy. I mean, how direct a correlation is there? And how concerned should we be about a really hard landing in China?
I probably should have started off at the beginning of explaining why, as an American, I spend as much time as I do in China. Because, frankly, I believe if you look at the big issues we face globally, it's hard to find a big issue, whether they're the economic issues, and I'll get to that, the environmental issues, the big, difficult foreign policy issues, which are not going to be much more possible to solve if we're working constructively with China. And it won't be very, very difficult to solve if we're not working well with them. And we have a lot of shared interests, but it's one thing to have shared interests, and another thing to turn those into complementary policies that build mutual trust. And so I think we can do more in that area. Now, in terms of the global economy, China is a big driver of global growth. And I say to any people I know that are rooting against China, I said, be careful what you root for, because our economic problems in this country are of our own making, we need to solve them, and the relationships with China will go better. I mean, they understand strength. We have to be strong economically, militarily, diplomatically, but every one of our economic problems, are going to be harder, I think, to solve if China has a problem. Now, so they're quite important. And there are all kinds of secondary and tertiary.
Well, can I just jump in there? Okay, I'll follow up when you're done.
So, Bob, I say the hard landing, okay? As I look at what's going on now in China, and I look at the bad debts that are building up at the municipal level, and I look at what's going on with state-owned enterprises, it's of concern. And I'm not making light of it, but the Chinese public isn't highly levered, and the government has got plenty of capacity. So if they manage it right, and they have many of the same leaders are still there that I watch them, recapitalize the banks and deal with the same triangle of problems between the banks and the state-owned enterprises and the government then. So there's certain things they need to do right, and we could talk about what those are. But I'm less concerned about those than I am several years down the road if they don't fix the flawed policies. Because every financial crisis, there's always banks make huge mistakes. There's a lot of people to blame, but they've got their roots in flawed policies. And so the key thing is China fixing those policies. I happen to think that our own financial system today, there's things we still have to do, but our system is, banks are much better regulated, better capitalized, that our capital markets are functioning as normal. I'm not as concerned in terms of what that does to our capital markets as I am as what it does in the headwinds it will create for our economy and what it will do to other countries around the world.
We're running low on time, so just a quick answer. I wonder if you wanted to evaluate the Obama administration's dealings with China. I mean, there's a kind of good cop, bad cop quality to it. We have this pivot to Asia, which is partly military muscle, but we also have this
Well, I think
close personal relationship that's building.
I think focus on Asia is important. Now, I wouldn't have used the word pivot. I don't want to sound partisan because I'm anything but. But for 150 years, the Pacific has been important to us. We should have spent more time. I happen to think that President Bush and I, with the SED, spent a lot of time in China. I think he had as good a relationships with Japan and India. I think it's been, but I do like what the Obama, I like the continuity, I like placing more emphasis. I think you can chase your tail at a lot of places around the world, but if we do more to put the U.S.-China relations on a even keel and to reset that, I think it'll make all the other issues easier to deal with. I think that the strength in Asia is important. I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think I'll end on that and just say one thing about this, that I said competition, I think, is key to China's reform. And I watched in Zhuangzi, 15 years ago or whenever, use WTO emission to drive reform and open up the market to foreign competition. And I look at reformers today wanting to do the same thing in China. The real reformers want not just to open up the markets domestically, they want to open it up internationally. So I think this bilateral investment treaty that the Obama administration is working on with China is very, very important, because to the extent that China identifies those areas that are close to foreign investment, and they don't carve out, the so-called negative list, carve out a big area and exempt from competition, this will speed up reform in China, it'll help build stronger companies in China, and it'll be great for U.S. companies. And I think that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is focused, has got the China's attention. I think the U.S. getting a deal there will also help lead the reform, and I look forward to the day we have a TPP and China's a member of that. So I think, having been in government and look at all the shots that people take when people are working hard there to do a good job, I'm pleased with the Obama administration's approach to China.
So fairly optimistic take there, Sheryl, but do you want to talk about the dangers of things not working out so well, and you do have growth slowing way down? And again, looking at this growing middle class and the Chinese people, what will it take for us to see serious unrest, real discontent? People might be willing to accept some of these restrictions on their freedom of speech and maybe even some of the smog in the air, as long as they're making money and the economy's growing and they're buying iPhones. But that's not necessarily going to last. So, what's the dark scenario?
Well, actually, I think a hard landing actually wouldn't necessarily be a dark scenario. I mean, I think that there are certain industries where they have seen crashes, like the property industry has seen crashes in certain areas, in certain cities. I don't think that you will see a crash to the extent that you did after Tiananmen Square, where GDP fell to 3%. I don't think it will crash like that. It will slowly lower if they are trying to balance, trying to bring around solutions for the environment with economic growth. So, I mean, a doomsday scenario could be something that comes from out of left field, not left field, but to their left bank. So it really could be from the South China Seas. It could be something from North Korea. And I think that would be more of a military confrontation. And I'm not sure that President Obama's words in Japan were helpful. I think that, on the one hand, he's trying to reassure the Asian allies that, we will protect Japan. But for the first time, for a president to actually acknowledge that, yes, the U.S. will actually have to support Japan if there's a confrontation over the the Spratly Island, the Senkaku Islands and the Diaoyu Islands. I think that that's antagonizing China in a way that it needn't be. In the past, when these comments have been made, mostly at the cabinet level, you didn't see a great result either. In fact, China just got more angry and aggressive. And you saw in Japan, they actually got encouraged to be more aggressive. And Japan actually purchased the islands, the Senkaku Islands, from a private owner, which then further antagonized the Chinese and escalated the affair. So I just think that the administration, I mean, they've done a lot of things pretty well, with regard to China, but I do think that there needs to be a much more comprehensive approach to policy with China. And maybe it's just not possible given just the nature of the world and what's going on in Russia, and so they get pulled away. But I just think that the China policy needs to be a little bit more comprehensive.
We only have a couple minutes left, but Bob, maybe I'll let you kind of tie it up. And on that note, how much do you worry about a real slowdown in the economy and a failure for this consumer class to emerge versus there really is a lot of growing instability in the region. There is talk of conflict. Who knows what North Korea will do? I mean, does that loom large on your radar? What's your...
Well, it does in a way, because if you're running a large global company today and you've got capital to invest, which fortunately we do, and you're pressured, as we all are, for growth, and you look at the world, and you look at Latin America, which has grown somewhat, but there's still a fair amount of economic and political instability. You look at Southeast Asia, huge growth, but very, very disparate in many respects, spread out over a large geographical area, some issues there. India would be one, very difficult market to enter, huge corruption issues in a number of those markets. You look at the instability of Russia. You look at Europe and you see, certainly Western Europe, no growth, low birth rate, negative birth rate in some countries. You look at the United States, where we still haven't come to grips with an immigration policy that makes sense to create growth. We still have dysfunction in Washington, which if you're running a company and you look at Washington, you don't turn to them for help because it's just not coming from there. And so then it takes you to China. We need China to create growth for our company, and I think for many other multinational companies. It's in our best interest for us to, one, have a good, strong relationship with China as a country. That means, I think, smart diplomacy and establishing it as a real priority. We need China to be stable. We need China to continue to create growth in order to create growth for our company. It's that simple. There aren't that many markets to turn to that are as obvious or as, I think, exciting in many respects, as hard as it is, in terms of the potential. It should be a top priority, and of course I worry. Every time I pick up the papers and I read a headline about the islands that you talked about, fortunately they were not considered by us to put a theme park, by the way. But you worry about things like that. Stability in the world obviously is important for companies like us to be successful, but stability in China, the relationship between China and the United States, vitally important.
Okay. We have 1 minute left. Hank, I don't know if you want to conclude. Is there a shoe for us to watch, a shoe that will drop anytime soon that will be decisive in 50 seconds or less?
Well, I think what's going on there over the next 8 to 10 years is going to be very, very fascinating to watch. What I am looking for in the shorter term is exactly the things I mentioned. I'm looking for the reforms that they have discussed and have debated getting implemented, some of the reforms in the financial markets and opening up the competition. So far, I'm pleased with what I've seen because there's such strong vested interests opposing some of those reforms. I think that what Xi Jinping has done in terms of consolidating power bodes well for getting these things done. But I just can't, you can't underestimate the importance of making progress here, because if they don't make progress over the next 6 to 10 years, I do not see a bright future for China. I really don't. So I think this is, this is a critically important time.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. We're out of time. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our panel. Thank you.